My guest today is Joe Edelman. Joe is a philosopher, game designer, programmer, and founder of the School for Social Design, where he has developed some remarkable social technology to collect data on users' values and design systems to nurture them. Joe's work is remarkably ambitious, I think, and exciting, and he has made more progress than I would have thought possible before getting to know his material. Joe, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So first question. You've criticized social systems design and software. So these are social media sites, Facebook, Instagram, maybe TikTok, for crowding out pre-existing values. Now, what I think is interesting as I look at the kind of the broad history of social system design, that's kind of the point, is somebody has an intent to indoctrinate a value system, and they design a social system to do that. And so crowding out of existing values is part of the plan. Now, I'm wondering what you think about that. It perhaps contains a prediction for where these social systems might go, but you have a different tack. So you want to actually nurture pre-existing values as opposed to change them.
Yeah, well, there's two places where I kind of make distinctions that aren't in that frame. So one is, the word values I think is confusing. I break it up into two categories, which I think behave very differently. So one I call ideological commitment. So you might have an ideological commitment to fairness, to giving people from different backgrounds a fair shake when you're hiring them. You might have an ideological commitment to a kind of transparency or accountability. And then a different set of values would be sources of meaning. So what are the things that are meaningful to you personally as you work, as you interact? Maybe being creative with other people is meaningful to you. Maybe being vulnerable or real. And so when I say respecting the values of the users in the case of social media, I mean the second things, the sources of meaning. Creating the kinds of conversations and interactions that are meaningful to people. So you can have an agenda on the ideological side. You can say, oh, I want more voices to be heard, for instance. But that's a little separate from what's meaningful to your users and whether your platform makes room for that. And then another distinction is the distinction between crowding out and something like inspiration. So you can inspire people. Like I think I was involved with couch surfing for many years. I was one of the people that worked in couch surfing, and we inspired a lot of people with values like hospitality and connecting across cultures and things like that. And these were sources of meaning, and we spread them. But this is very different than crowding out. This is not like a social pressure mechanism that gets people to be hospitable or to be to connect across cultures. This is more of a possibility that becomes a new source of meaning for the users. So I wouldn't call that crowding out.
So one of the things that I struggle with as I've been studying for this interview, and I come across this problem a lot when I read a lot of philosophy, and I've had some philosophers on this show, is you get really tangled up in I don't want to use this slightly pejorative term, but jargon, right? So
Sure.
The definitions of specific words, so concepts, and there's a real analytical separation between some of these ideas, right? But man, do they get muddled easily in your mind. And, I went through some of your exercises with my in-laws this past weekend to try and elicit values of what their values were. And I think it was partly successful. We achieved, I think, the emotional outcome that I think is part of the intent, which is this sort of feeling of meaningfulness, where I was conducting the interview, and of both of my in-laws, my wife was out of town, so I snuck it in there. And it was a very exciting and energetic conversation, right? We felt like we had arrived on things that really mattered to them. But I think the distinction between values and ideologies were quite blurred. To some extent, I think that my kind of practical, at least actualization of these ideas was that an ideology is simply your values that you want other people to, or a value agenda, right? Or a thing you want to spread around the world, but it's not necessarily something, you might not even feel it yourself. It might be very cynical. So you might say, I want everybody to, wear blue sweaters on Fridays, and I'm really meaningful to me. I mean, it's almost like it's very subjective in a certain sense. you can achieve the emotional outcome without necessarily adhering, I think, to your definitional kind of categories. What do you think about that? I mean, you've done a lot of this, right? So what do you think about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it is it takes our students a lot of analysis and unpacking before they begin to separate these things. They come in bundles. Like, for instance, masculinity bundles up a lot of different ideological commitments and a lot of different sources of meaning. There's like being a provider can be an expectation that like weighs on you, or it can be a strong source of meaning. And you can say, hey, I'm doing this for my family, and it's like super meaningful to me that I am this kind of like pillar of support, right? So one way to think about the distinction is that it's just different motivations, like for maybe the same thing. So let's say you're talking to your kid and you're trying to be really honest as a way of setting expectations in your relationship. That's what I would call an ideological commitment to honesty within this relationship with your child or something. Like, we are honest here, right? And that's just a very different motivation than like, oh, I find it super meaningful to be honest right now. Like, these are just, they might manifest in the same behavior, but you can probably tell me after you did it which kind of conversation you're having with your son. Was it the source of meaning motivated one, or was it the like setting expectations for the family kind of motivated one? You wouldn't have such a hard time saying which one it was.
I search for kind of like concrete truth to reference the stuff again sometimes. And what I mean by that is like behaviors, right? So what are the things you do as a consequence of believing whatever it is you say you believe? And there's a lot of, the human mind can be a mess, right? I mean, you have this post hoc rationalization where people like, they say they kind of meant to do something when they did it, but they actually, it's just totally fabricated. We're a complicated machine, the human consciousness, but behaviors are real. You did do this thing or you did not. Those are factual. And to me, like, affecting behavior has to be the goal. Your internal state is kind of something that is unobservable, and you can kind of get at it with the interview techniques, and they really are really interesting and powerful, honestly, and I do mean that. But like, ultimately, if it does or does not move behavior, that's kind of like the test of whether it worked or whether it's real. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's kind of true, but it can get you into a lot of trouble because there's often many ways of describing behavior, many models which will which you can use to analyze behavior. And if you're not listening to people at all, then you don't really have, so you can, like for instance with the prisoner's dilemma and game theory, right? You can always change the payoff matrices to make it look like people are being self-interested. And so there's sort of like these two models there, right? Okay, do I believe that people are being self-interested, or do I believe that people actually care about other people's welfare? And the same behavior will go for either, can point towards either model. So I think this is a problem with, especially economists have this preference profiles or utility maximization framework that really you can apply that to any behavior. Like, it's such a flexible framework that you can apply it to any behavior. And then you have this problem. Well, okay, are people just maximizing their utility? Are they just following dopamine? Are they just, there's all these like models. And so then it does, I think, make sense to listen to people to try to differentiate between multiple models that each can predict behavior.
I unreleased actually, but the podcast, which is in the bank, get released soon, is the one I did with Brian Nozick, who's a psychologist, really big into right now into the kind of the validity of a lot of social science experiments, whether they're hacked or not. But earlier on in his career, he was one of the kind of founding group of implicit bias research. And implicit bias is super kind of confusing because on the one hand, we profess to have a certain value, and we may or may not adhere to that value in our behaviors. And it's easy to like convince somebody that to have a different value, apparently, but it's not easy to change their behavior. So like the behavioral outcome, sort of this messy middle part, which is, partly individualistic, partly socially constructed, partly whatever. You can talk somebody in almost anything or saying anything, or, who knows what they really mean or believe. But the behavior in the end, I suppose what my question is, like, what are the consequences of poorly motivated behavior that doesn't change? Like, in two different motivations, same behavior, what's the difference in kind of your model, or what's the cost or the penalty, or what's the point?
I think so. Critiquing again, maybe the standard kind of economic preference profile thing. You get, if you have too flexible a model, then it can describe behavior really well, like it overfits, but it becomes less useful. So you have all these people, they're using social media, they say they regret it, they're trying to get off cigarettes or whatever. Preference profiles just say, okay, well, they prefer cigarettes, they prefer TikTok, right?
Yes.
Like, we don't listen to their words. There's nothing else we can do. There's no guidance there about taxes. There's no guidance there about, right? Like, this is just what the people want. And that's not very powerful, right? So then you have to look for other models that might explain some kind of, inner, and there's been a succession of these in behavioral economics, and there's like the system 1, system 2 kind of. There's a whole bunch of like multiple minds, elephant and rider, and then more recently there's the kinds of, so the model I use is that there's values, and then there's a whole bunch of different norms and expectations. It's really easy to give people a new norm in a room, and that actually does change their behavior, but it doesn't change them in a deep way, right? It just says like, oh, in this room we do things this way, and then as soon as they're out of the room, they'll go back to their behavior. So there's many layers, and it's quite hard to see through the different layers to see what people really want. And also people change. People get inspired by role models. They change what they want. And so this is like a messier model with many more kinds of layers. Probably easier to confuse yourself, but it has the chance of getting at some deeper truths.
I like messy, by the way, because, hey, that's just the way it is, right? There's
Sure,
no point running away from that. I mean, it's going to be messy, and if it ain't messy, it probably ain't useful, because there's just too many what appear to be edge cases in your simple model, but actually are just kind of like pretty mainstream. Maybe you can talk a little bit, probably should get into this now, of how exactly you do elicit values. What is the techniques you train? Maybe you can describe the school a little bit, too, and kind of what the goals are and how you go about it.
Sure, yeah. So I teach people to make social things that are meaningful, and meaningful to in certain specific ways. So, somebody's trying to make. So, for instance, some of the people from Facebook groups went through my program. They were really interested in a certain kind of group, groups of like cancer survivors or people who have drug addictions, or so like. Can people be vulnerable? What kind of ways can people support each other in Facebook groups? How can they, can depressed people discuss their suicidal ideations and like get help from each other and support each other? This kind of stuff, right? And what's the difference in the design of chat threads and comments and the way that profiles look in the groups and so on, that makes people less likely to connect. So that's an example of a kind of application that people go through my course with. They do this with not just social apps, but also organizations, ownership structures. We've had some like legal structures, community land trusts, things like that. Always with social roles and some underlying sources of meaning that we want to foster, that either come from the users, participants, or the creators of the thing. And so the course goes in parts, and the first month is mostly about measurement and figuring out how to measure the meaning that's happening or not happening, where I teach a kind of a survey method. I teach an in-person interview method, or like a Zoom-based interview method that's like a very high-res way of telling whether the meaning's happening, and then a survey method that you can survey tens of thousands of users at the same time or something. That's the first month of the course, and then the second month is a bunch of design-related stuff. So how would the product actually change to make those numbers better? So that's the program I teach. And then the method, so the interview method, the easiest, we can start from a lot of different sources of data to get people's sources of meaning. But the easiest is just stories of meaningful things that happen. So if you have people on Facebook groups, again, who have had really meaningful encounters with strangers, you might just ask them to tell those stories. And then by asking a series of questions, like follow-up questions after hearing the story of the meaningful experience, you can create one of these, we call them values cards, one of these little cards that sort of describes the meaning and helps you build a survey to see whether that's just happening for that one user or happening for many people. You can double-click on any part of that if...
Yeah, there's lots. I'll tell you one just personal observation about this. I was worried, and we had an exchange just before I did this with my in-laws. You didn't know this, but I asked you, what if somebody says, what the heck is meaning? Because that was something that I was wondering about. And I might be a little bit, I don't know, overstudied on this stuff because I've gone down several different paths of defining meaning, and I've gotten confused for which one I'm talking about. But that didn't come up. It didn't come up. And you pointed out some materials for me, and I sort of like, okay, I think we're getting at here. And then I asked my in-laws, so can you think of a meaningful experience? And both of them ran out. They're like, oh yeah, here we go. And they just sort of have this, it might be like a lay interpretation of the meaning because they haven't looked into this stuff and all, but we got to the right stuff, right content, right? It's kind of back to this sort of, the language, we might not be talking about the same words, but they understand what I'm looking for conceptually. That's kind of more of like a Jordan Peterson meaning, and meta meaning here now, where he's saying, this is motivating action. I'm trying to motivate them to tell me a story of something important to them, and they kind of get what I'm getting at, even though I could have used almost any word there that was broadly similar. So that's kind of interesting. And they came back with just important experiences to them that had a huge emotional resonance. So that was. It was anyway, it was quite powerful. I want to come back to the concept of what you could do to designs, because that's interesting, because I think that as I go through social media, I have my own kind of preferences for social media. I don't use Facebook. I do use LinkedIn and Twitter for whatever reason. But I wonder whether that whatever reason is actually down to the design of the software, and it's giving me what I want inside of it. If you, I don't know how much you use these things in different ones, but maybe you can give us some examples of patterns that do or do not encourage certain behaviors, because you tend to just think, I'm just a person interacting with the world. But one interesting concept that you kind of put me onto was the design of the flow of information can really materially constrain or encourage certain kinds of behavior and emotional outcomes.
Yeah, sure. So I like Twitter. I think Twitter is a little difficult. Some people have set it up in a way that really works, and other people haven't.
Interesting.
So Twitter's kind of bimodal in terms of how meaningful it is and how meaningless and addictive it is. There's a lot of people that have very bad experience with Twitter. But I have a good experience, and my experience is around a kind of, maybe you have the same thing. I'm kind of a para-academic, right? I'm a researcher, but I'm not affiliate. I'm not part of a university. And so that's kind of lonely. And Twitter is where my department water cooler kind of, I have this feeling that I can tweet things. I can tweet things that I'm working on, essay that I'm working on. People give me feedback. They get excited about it. I feel like Twitter is a lot where my colleagues are and where I can kind of chat with a bunch of other philosophers, people that are also economists, this kind of, and I feel very lucky to have this, set of colleagues that are hanging around in a virtual space. And this is super meaningful to me, this kind of camaraderie, intellectual camaraderie or something like that. And I know other people who feel the same way about Twitter. And what is it that makes Twitter like that? I think the follow graph and the way that Twitter helps you build your follow graph and kind of prune it is really helpful. Lists are also kind of helpful in that direction. And there's kind of an interesting, Twitter is the actual shape of the graph is relevant here. Whereas Facebook has got friends and family and much more of kind of it's like almost everybody is Facebook friends. Twitter operates in a certain kind of, it's in between friends and professional, right? Whereas LinkedIn is more fully professional.
Yep.
So the use is more likely, the use that I take of it.
Is it the case
also
that
textuality?
I was just gonna. But I was thinking that they do occupy different sort of social spaces. Is it just the case that there will always be one for family and kind of everybody, one for your sort of like intellectual interests, and one for professional interests? Like, does the design matter? There was always going to be one in each of those slots because you can't overlap those senses of identity. Is that? I mean, it's like that's an argument against this concept that any of this matters. Like, we're just going to have one social network for each of these.
Oh, well. So Telegram is becoming more and more like a social network, and Telegram is very heavily used in Europe and Berlin, which is where I live. And Telegram doesn't have this problem. Telegram, you can create groups and channels, and you can group your groups and channels by tabs. So I have a tab for friends. I have a tab for like work colleagues. I have a tab for, as Telegram builds itself out Telegram has a very nice structure. Discord and Slack also mix all of these different realms. So I don't think that the companies have to go along with the social graphs.
Interesting. Cool. So, I mean, pick up the thread. Sorry, you were just about to start talking about design features and how they can influence these things. I interrupted you.
Yeah. So, one thing that's very important is whether you have a sense of who you're posting to. And in Facebook, this is very bad, in my opinion, the way that they've set up the recommender and newsfeed for most people, for many people. You kind of have no idea who will see the things that you post, especially if like I have like maybe 4,000 friends and followers on Facebook or whatever. And I feel like it's just it's a lottery. Like some random person that I met in Alabama might see the thing that I posted that I have nothing in common with. Somebody like my aunt might see it. A professional colleague might see it, right? And it's only going to be like 100 out of those 5,000 people or something that will at least engage with it. And this is terrible. This is like creates a kind of stage fright, right? Like you don't know who you're talking to.
Yeah.
And so that's a good example of what not to do. And this is also easy to get in this situation with, somebody like Elon Musk is in this situation on Twitter, right? Like where just everybody he's talking to everybody. And that's a very chilling effect. And things where I find in general, my best communication starts with an intimate group and then kind of grows from there. And this is something that I expect to see more of in the future is social networks that let you post first to a smaller circle, and then once they've seen it, revised it, commented on it, then it goes out. So you kind of start safe, and you start with a better sense of your audience.
Yeah, and WhatsApp, I use that for when I write something, or basically, I don't publish too much written content, but when I do, there's a WhatsApp group, a couple of them, a few emails, close friends. So is it right to say that the collective, the thing that these people in these groups have in common are values? Is that kind of the way you imagine designing these groups is centered around certain kind of value preferences?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's reasons to communicate with people besides shared values, but I think shared values are one of the most useful ways to gather people because for two reasons. One is that people with shared values will look for the same kind of excellence in terms of the conversation they're having.
Yeah.
And so that makes it very clear what to post. Like people that appreciate great intellectual rigor or something, you might put them together in a group. They could be intellectually rigorous together. And the other thing is that they like to do the same kinds of interaction. So people that really like being creative together will be creative in a meme group or something. People that really like being honest or open or vulnerable or something will be honest or open or vulnerable in some kind of sharing about our lives group or something. And so, yeah.
What are the most common values? I mean, you've probably, I don't know how many of these interviews you've participated or observed. As I was working, the one that came out most prominently with my in-laws anyway, was this concept of working hard. They're like, we're workers. We love to work. We feel good. If you took the outcome away and we still did the work, we would still love, we still feel good about ourselves, sort of ticking the boxes for you. And I thought, that's good. I agree. I like that one too. But that's A lot of people are going to have that one, probably. And so there's going to be massive overlap on some of these, I have to think.
Sure. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And it's actually, that lessens their import, because if everybody shares a value, then you don't feel such a special connection when you find other people who have it, right? I think that even more common than that one are, so that's maybe the contribution, or, so I run into two versions of that, maybe more. One would be something about contributing, like finding a place to contribute. And another would be about responding, like showing up, I guess would be the maybe the word people would use. Like, I show up, I when there's an issue, I'm there for it. When there's some work to be done, when there's a pile of dishes, I show up for that, or whatever.
Interesting.
So I'm not sure if the one that you had with your in-laws was one of those. Something even more common than that are honesty-related ones, like
right.
Honesty and integrity. Like I say the thing that needs to be said. Or I follow my true feeling about things.
Do you? I mean, 'cause I had an economist called Robin Hanson on the podcast a couple times, actually. One of them was talking about his book, The Elephant in the Brain, where the Robin Hanson back here is saying, do you really buy that, though? Like, are they actually honest? I mean, isn't it the case that we have secret motivations for so many things? We lie all the time, even to ourselves. So honesty is the thing that, is kind of like a thing that we want to believe about ourselves. And maybe but it ain't the case, because, that's just, we can't live our lives and actually, have that value.
Sure. Well, so it's different whether somebody is claiming to have a code or whether they're claiming to have a source of meaning. So
interesting.
Somebody may not be that honest that much of the time, but when they are honest, they find it super meaningful. They're like, this was so freeing and so real, this, to finally say this thing to my, right? Maybe they've been lying the last 3 years, so they're not an honest person.
Right.
But when they say that honesty is one of their sources of meaning, they're telling the truth.
Oh, that's amazing. So to me, that it like creates this category of value, and I don't mean that in we're overloading that word big time here, but of emotional positivity that isn't really deep. Because if they just sort of said, I'm honest all the time or everywhere, their life would probably fall apart, right? I'm always going to say the thing, it's like you just can't live that way. So it's like there's a dosage makes the poison, right? So it's like, maybe a little bit more honesty at this margin would be good for you. But if you go overdo it, then your life's going to fall apart and you're not going to feel meaningful because you're going to disrupt all these relationships. You're going to feel maligned and all this kind of stuff, right? So it's not like it's an unambiguous and limited good pursuing these values.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's one of the places where ethics, morality, the philosophers have been really wrong, because there's whether you're a utilitarian or a Kantian or whatever, there's a tendency towards the idea that ethics is about moral codes, is about always doing it that way, and that's just dumb.
Yeah. It's and I'll put a few cards on the table here for myself. So this is the thing that I'm really interested in learning in this conversation, and maybe, and certainly after this for the rest of my life, probably, and maybe even with you some, is how to motivate virtuous behavior. And I take it really from a kind of operationalization of that concept. I don't mean be better to people, although I do mean that. You're right. I mean, I would love to pursue that, but I don't know how to pursue that. The thing I know how to pursue is how to get people to buy insurance. And I can't help but laugh a little bit about that. But in the most, I think, straightforward conception of insurance is it's preparing for things that could happen to you that are bad, or to people around you that are bad, right? So there's a virtuous, deeply virtuous aspect to insurance. And if you do that properly, then you live a better life, right? And we have lots of delayed gratification is sort of like a very generalized way of thinking about insurance. So I'm not getting something today, but later on something bad's going to happen to me. Like, for example, last weekend, my father-in-law said, "Hey, there's a nail in your tire of your car." And I was like, "Oh, wow. He knows more about these things than me." He said, "You could drive for a little while on it, but you have to get that replaced." I said, "Okay." That was Sunday. And on Tuesday, I had to take my kid around all kinds of stuff. And we're driving back home. The tire blew up. grinding on the street, and I was like, I left it.
Yeah, sure.
I knew I had to do it. I didn't freaking do it. And now I have to, so we managed to get in the driveway at my house, and it's pouring rain outside. Very dangerous. That was stupid. And then change the tire, bring it in, all that kind of crap, right? So like, I simply, I think of that kind of behavior as analogous to not buying insurance, right? So I could have imposed a cost now, but I just sort of delayed it. I'm going to do it later. And to me, like, so motivating virtuous behavior is something I care about. And I want to look for frameworks that can help us tie ourselves to the mast, right? So how can you motivate virtuous behavior? Because to me, it's like, if you can't get somebody to buy insurance with your social theory, it's probably not right, right? Because like, that's something that's like, you're trying to talk yourself into it. We need a mechanism to force us to do something that is good, right? Do you see a way for your framework of using values as a source of motivation to get somebody to buy insurance, or more generally pursue kind of this virtuous behavior that is immediately perhaps costly?
Yeah, I'm not sure that tying yourself to the mast is the best way to frame it. The word I use is redesign.
Okay.
Because the tie to the mast kind of thing is individualistic. But as you wrote, I read one of your blog posts about underwriting and morality, and you talked about social, like how much of people's ethics is social, and I think that's really true. So, I'd say environmental even beyond social. So, people in certain social contexts and certain economic contexts are going to have an easier time buying insurance, right? And they're going to have an easier time. People in a group where honesty is rewarded are going to have a much easier time being honest than people in a group where people get really pissed at you when you say something real, right? And I think we all have the experience of wandering into both kinds of rooms. You go to somebody else's family or something, you're like, holy shit, like I can't say anything here. That's not how it works, right? And it's similar with these other. Maybe prudence would be the virtue for insurance or something. Mm-hmm. There's going to be rooms where prudence is the thing, where prudence is easy, where everyone's doing it, where the whole and this has to do with a whole bunch of structural factors, including so one structural factor is what crowd you're with. Another structural factor is, do you have a regular, can you budget? Like, do you have a regular income that you can allocate your, insurance premium to, right? How far can you forecast your life? How normal is your life? And how, if you're budgeting an insurance premium, can you predict that in 5 years you'll still be able to pay that premium and so on?
Yes.
So that's what I would do. Instead of tying yourself to the mast, instead of pre-committing or something like that, I would say, how do you get somebody into a crowd?
Yes.
Where prudence is the thing. How do you get somebody to a forecast of their income for the next 5 years, so that they can say by the time something like this might actually happen, they're still going to be paying their insurance premium. They're still going to be insured, right? How do you change the structural factors so that prudence is advisable?
Well, I mean,
possible.
What I think history teaches us about buying insurance is that the way you do it is you pass a law to force people to do it, basically, or it's compulsion. And so there's another essay I wrote, which is all insurance purchases are compelled. I'm not happy about this, but this is what I observe, is that voluntary insurance kind of doesn't exist. And that, I mean, kind of individualistic. As you were kind of saying there, I can tie myself to the mast, and I think you're right. It's like, actually, even Odysseus, somebody else had to tie him to the mast. And so you have this social compulsion, or, and that gives a very general term. The word social can be, legislative compulsion. It can be contractual compulsion. It's all compulsion. Like, there's not really another way. And I call it relationally violent, right? So it's somebody forcing you to do something against your will. And one of the amazing things about our society, and I wonder what you think about if you've studied any of this anthropologist, Joe Henrich, Secret of Our Success. His point is the way that we are mostly compelled is by mimicking people, high status people, and doing what they do. And we kind of do it not really mindlessly, but there's some rationalization that goes on there maybe. But we want to kind of like copy their success. And so we do the things they do without really totally understanding why they do them. And that exists on the individualistic and also the societal level. And so cultures copy cultures as well. If one culture's got a really sophisticated insurance system, culture B will be like, well, that sounds like a good idea. And so they do the same thing. They don't really totally, they kind of get the arguments, but they don't know why it's efficient. They don't know the magnitude or the contribution of that part of the system to the success of culture A. They just do it. They just sort of copying stuff because they want to, mimic a high status individual. These are not rational processes. This is not me saying I want to do this, and this is not a causal chain that is kind of in any way conscious. It's being forced to by somebody else, or by simply subverting yourself to another person's behavior or kind of entity's behavior. And one of the things that encourages me about your work is that there's a little more thought behind kind of what we're doing, but I don't see a lot of evidence in the world for that kind of really being able to generate, meaningful outcomes economically at scale. What do you think?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I think of society as made up of like organized in terms of scales. And that's this kind of macro scale, like national policies, policies that apply to everybody in a state, that kind of thing. I work mostly on the meso and micro scale. So I work mostly on designing things within an organization, within a social network. Social networks are kind of amazing in that they're like, code is kind of like law. Like it structures interactions very, very tightly.
Yes.
So, you change how commenting works, you change what kind of information shows up to strangers and so on. It changes for everybody immediately. Right. And it's also super well instrumented. So you can see the effects. You can be much more rational and responsive in your design. At Couchsurfing, there were huge changes that, when I arrived, there was like 70% positive experiences. When I left, like 94% positive experiences. Huge reductions in theft and other kinds of crime on Couchsurfing, things like that. And this is because of changes we made, where we make the change, we watch the cohort, sometimes A/B testing, we split the users in two, half of them have the change, we see the incidents, over the next few days, right? Sometimes even hours. So this is very different than the kind of domains that you were talking about. And I'm curious, social networks are one place where this much more intentional, iterative approach works even for billions of people. This is maybe the first time on Earth that's ever happened.
Yeah.
And I wonder how much government will follow. I have the feeling that what will happen, what I hope will happen, is that first social networks will be much better. Like they'll be good for us. Like right now they're bad for us, I think, on net. It's hard to say. There's a lot of costs, a lot of benefits.
Yeah.
So first we'll crack that and we'll make decent social networks. And then if we do that, then I think the governments can follow, and we'll have instrumented experimental governments that, that work, that are very well aligned with social good, and that are very intentional and responsive. But that might be a while before we get to that stage.
So you use the word social good there, and that was another kind of theme from the beginning of this concept of, what is social good? Most would probably adopt an ideological slant on that. They'll say social good is whatever your left-wing, right-wing agenda, everybody's got their kind of preferences, pretty strong preferences, and what they want to do is they want to commandeer the system to promote their social good, right? Because I think that people just have the ideological urge is super strong, right? And I admire your restraint in that, if I'm seeing it right, or maybe you do have preferences for defining very carefully what the social good means, other than simply whatever you want. I mean, it's kind of like this, pluralist verging on kind of relativist kind of, you can take this pretty far. What do you think about that? I mean, it must be in your mind. At the very least, you could teach somebody these tools who could then co-opt them for some serious ideological work, right?
Yeah. No, I think that is a concern, and I worry about it sometimes. So I think that it's true that I'm less ideological than a lot of people on the left and right. I just think it's also, we're seeing an exaggerated political polarization and an exaggerated ideological situation right now.
Yes.
Because of what plays on social media largely. Also because current systems are breaking down and then people sort of fight, just like they did in Germany pre-World War II, right? There's the communists, the fascists. Like, it's clear that the current thing isn't working. Yeah. And so this brings out the enemies of the system on both sides. So we have that, plus we have social media and outrage and all the incentives to polarization in the media ecosystem. So I think that people are not actually as polarized as it seems, and not usually as polarized as they are today. And the social good. So then, what does social good mean? I think that it does mean, to me and to like sort of liberals of the last 100 years or something, like people should be able to do the things they like. And then the question is like, okay, how exactly do you define that? I think economists usually still believe that. The problem is that they define it in terms of preferences, in terms of revealed preferences, like in terms of behavior. People should be able to do the stuff they're doing, which just doesn't work because people actually regret a lot of the stuff that they're doing. Yeah. They don't actually like the stuff they're doing. So then you have to have some other way of defining what people should be free to do, but which people should be able to do what's meaningful to them is the way that I would do it. But this is not such a big departure from like kind of ordinary liberalism. It's just switching the preferences for the meaning,
So I'm going to guess that, there are limits to your pluralism, right? I mean, people can get meaning from doing some pretty awful stuff. And an objective, I'm not saying objective, I suppose it's hard to kind of use that word, but
sure.
Most would agree that some things are real bad. Hurting people, torturing, those kind of stuff. I get a sense of meaning of doing something awful to people or animals or something. So you kind of like, there has to be a toolkit here for evaluating values, right? I mean, the extreme at scale deployment of the Chinese, surveillance state, there we go. So you could see if like a communist dictatorship, using kind of older terminology, but fascist, whatever it is, dictatorship could peer inside the minds of people and understand this person's value system is one that's going to threaten me in the future. That's not a good piece of information to get, for that person who's the subject of that inquiry. Increased, and this is kind of one of the interesting, I do mean it when I say this is a social technology you're developing here, that will give ever more power to people who have an ideological agenda. I don't know. There's not really an answerable question, but surely it's something that you kind of think about once in a while.
Yeah. So first of all, I may be wrong in this. It's not something that I have a lot of empirical data on, but from my interviews with people, people's values are really good mostly.
Yeah.
Like when like when you were interviewing your in-laws, like I've done a lot of that. I've done hundreds of those kinds of interviews, maybe 1,000. And mostly I'm just like, yes.
It's good stuff.
That's good stuff. Yeah. So this doesn't make me like worried about people when left to their values. It makes me kind of feel like it will be great. And that there's a lot of social good that comes from freeing people from the things that keep them from doing what's meaningful to them. That's overall my kind of, and maybe I'm just an optimist. And in terms of people misusing this stuff, I think it's a real danger. I think that that's part of why we have to spread a kind of a stance about what the world should look like along with the technology. Like we have to spread our own kind of ideology. I mean, it's kind of meaning libertarianism or something like.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
We have
pluralism.
to spread that.
You call it pluralism,
yeah,
right?
Pluralism. Yeah.
Yeah.
We have to spread pluralism along with what we do, and I'm worried that we won't be able to do that. But that's the thing to try, I guess.
Well, I mean, I did a podcast with Joe Henrik. I mentioned him a minute ago, Cultural Evolution, and here's the thing I worry about, your reaction to this. I worry that there is an inherent destruction of meaning that is part of the economic growth process. So back to this point about we copy successful cultures. To me, success it comes down to a kind of wealth measurement. So I had Tyler Cowen on the podcast talking about his book Stubborn Attachments, GDP plus. So he says it's GDP, which is great, all these great features of measuring well-being, plus some externalities, and there's some things he's thrown in there. He's not too super clear about what those are, but you get the concept. He's sort of relaxing the strict definition of GDP as a measure of well-being, and I buy it. I mean, I at least buy it as a revealed preference for human societies. Right, so the most successful societies tend to be the ones that are richest, and those are the ones that are admired by lesser successful societies who, haphazardly trying to adopt the policies of the more successful societies over time. The way to get to successful economic growth is to coordinate huge groups of people in markets that allows them to specialize and trade with each other and generate economic growth. Right now, the thing that Henrik taught me was that there was in the olden days, 2,000 years ago, something like that, we lived in things called kin groups where we coordinated with our extended family, a few hundred people. And he tells a story which is a little more controversial, but he talks about how the Catholic Church broke down those kin group barriers through outlawing cousin marriage and this sort of stuff. The point there is that we had a more broadly connected society, economically speaking. We traded with people that weren't our kin group. Now we trusted them. And so certain social mechanisms allowed us to trust these more distant people, but we have a lot less information about them. And so my theory goes, we've lost meaning in that trade. So we get greater scale, less meaning, and they are intimately linked. In order to have this scale, we have to be able to communicate and coordinate with people we will never meet. I mean, if you ever imagine you can't even imagine the concept of 10 million people. Like that's just so many people, and that's not even a very big place in terms of the global scale today, right? You got to coordinate with hundreds of millions, billions of people at once. You're never going to know them. They're going to be distant people, and so you naturally wind up not really deriving as much meaning from them. The trade we've made is to reduce the local relationships to spread the coordination across society that is inherently less meaningful. And so I worry that that the trend is clear and it means more growth, less meaning in our society. And I wonder what you think about that. There's a lot there.
Yeah, so I think your analysis is 100% correct, except for the word trend.
Okay.
We did, I think, a series of trades that worked for a while, trading things like intimacy against things like economic growth and productivity. And those were good trades for a while. And we, on the margin, we kept making, I think, fairly good decisions as a society. And you get a lot of meaning back from being wealthy, like a wealthier society, right? You get, you can organize into choirs and
more leisure
board
time.
Games.
Yes,
and,
certainly.
Right? You start having richer arts and richer sciences. And so there's a lot of wins that come from, and those wins are on the back of people, working in factories and, not necessarily, you're doing a trade-off on the level of individual lives too, right? Like an individual life, you grind, but you get paid.
Yeah.
And you get to use that in a way that's meaningful to you. And I actually think that wealth and meaning were kind of aligned, but making a kind of a tough trade-off, with serious costs and serious benefits in terms of the wealth per meaning or whatever happening the whole time. And what we've seen recently is that wealth and meaning became disaligned. And that's why we have massive increases in depression, obesity, social media addiction. People are stopping to marry, they're stopping having kids, all these demographic shifts, isolation, bowling alone, all this stuff, right? Political polarization. This is happening because the trade that we learned how to make as a society is no longer paying off. But that doesn't mean we should go backwards. That means we should stop making that particular trade. Okay. Yep. Right? We should stay at the same level of affluence and work on the thing that we're no longer getting by other means, right? So, because additional wealth or additional grind, actually, on the level of an individual family is no longer paying a meaning benefit the way it did maybe 60 years ago. 60 years ago, it was like, work hard and you're going to get all of these benefits, right?
Yes.
And now it's kind of like, oh no, actually working an additional bit is kind of a bad deal. Like, it's not and the wealthiest societies are no longer the most meaningful, like, or the societies that are working the hardest. It's one of the reasons I live in Europe rather than the US. Europe has lower GDP per capita, but it's, I think, way more like meaning per capita. But the difference is small, right? Like, it's just the last little marginal bit where the US and I think also the UK kind of screwed this up. And so it's not about becoming, going back to where we were 200 years ago or something. It's about unwinding the hustle just a little bit and looking for community wins, meaning wins, other ways of organizing more meaningful things. Is that a good answer to your question?
It is. Yep. It's a coherent answer. I'm not sure I buy it though, as kind of the way things going to play out, because the thing that is super powerful that many people malign is the transmission mechanism for behavior at scale. So, the Henrik story is more successful societies, and he's a little, I think, agnostic about what the definition of success, but others will say wealth. That's what I would say anyway. So the wealthier societies are admired and copied. Now, we can see wealth and measure it, and we can see they have, I grew up in Canada, came down here, there are more luxury cars. My parents remarked it. I remember remarking it in the United States and Canada. They're just cheaper. Than they are elsewhere, and so we buy more of them. And you're like, boy, that's cool. You can have a Mercedes, and I can get a Toyota or a Lexus Toyota or whatever, right? And that's a small thing, but if that gulf widens, and now you can get flying cars in the United States, and you can't get them in Canada, right? And now there's this pretty big gap because we chose this more meaningful path, but now we're kind of feel like we're falling behind because on the measurable, observable consequences of our decisions, we look like we're losing because, we might have a better internal state, but envy will take hold, right? And suddenly we want to ditch those cultural decisions and move towards the ones that are generating the more kind of obvious physical outcomes.
Yeah, sure. So I think you're right. And we got to be careful of that. And there's two ways I see to work against that possibility. So one is just making the meaning difference much more observable and numerical and documented. And I think you can do that with numbers. Like we don't have a number that's like the meaning equivalent of GDP right now, but we will if my work keeps going the way that it's going. I think we will in 3 years.
Okay.
You'd also want personal stories, and I think this goes to the other thing. So people copy things that are packaged up. Like I think Hollywood actually does a lot of that work. That's
sure.
Why so many other countries wanted to copy America, and it's not really because we're wealthy. I mean, that's a big part of it. But it's because we have some kind of packaged lifestyle that people can see and aspire to. And this happens on all levels in society. Like you just meet somebody, maybe they used to be a broker and now they're a massage therapist and they're much happier or something. You meet one person like this, it makes you think, oh, maybe I should quit my finance job or something, right?
Yeah.
Like that person's so happy, right?
Yeah.
And it works the same way you see a movie and you're like, oh, that person is, really looks really good on Wall Street in this movie, right? So we'll need to somehow, whatever society is that wins on meaning, will have to also dominate media and export like packaged lifestyles in this way.
Well, one other piece to this is the concept of status. This is something Robin Hanson talks about a lot, and he studies it very deeply. I think he hates it, and I don't think he would admit to that, maybe. But you really get the feeling that he hates the concept of status and how it contaminates our rationalist, otherwise rationalist impulses. And I asked this question of Joe Henrik, where he documented as well this sort of change in the marker of status from a dominance status hierarchy in let's say like lizards or something. There's evidence actually that dominance hierarchies don't even exist in chimpanzees, but through to humans, where it's a different kind of thing. Where it's not just dominance, much more about being able to coordinate with people and being sort of like prestige is different. And so the prestige hierarchy is the one that exists today, and there was an amazing that changed at one point in evolutionary history. I mean, Joe makes the point that it's a biological mechanism. I don't know, but I think that what you're talking about there is changing the way that we measure status, because you don't mimic the wealthy person, you mimic the high status person, right? And one of the interesting things that social media and software gives us is like the traditional definition of prestige is when you sit in a room and all the descriptions that Henrik has for it are like are physical space. So who walks in the room, pays attention to them, who's got the physical charisma, right? And online charisma is different. We use Zoom calls now, and you probably notice this. Sometimes you'll talk to somebody online versus in person, and you can have a very different impression of them from a prestige standpoint. To be an impressive person on Zoom, and in person they're like, oh, hi, I thought you were be taller or something, right? And it can be the other way around. Totally. Somebody in person can be very impressive, and on Zoom it can be flat. It's like there's something else going on there. And so maybe there's an opportunity to scramble that prestige system to create something else that we want to envy, and so mimic. That's a foundational structure for the way that we guide our own behavior. Any thoughts on that? I don't know. Maybe we're talking about trying to do something new there.
I do think so, and I think that even just the articulacy about values or sources of meaning that I'm talking about has an effect there. I wonder if you feel like it did with your in-laws. I don't know. Maybe you can't say this in the air, but I find that often I admire people more and I respect people more after I discover their sources of meaning.
Interesting.
And so I have the feeling, I think my general model is that as a culture, we get articulate and communicative about different kinds of aspects of ourselves at different times. So, a couple hundred years ago, people were getting articulate about their goals for the first time. And they started talking about their goals. I want to open a library. I want to start a business. I want to whatever. And then, 20th century, people start getting articulate about their feelings. They start saying, I feel sad today. So I see what's coming as people getting articulate about their sources of meaning. I find it meaningful to X. I find it meaningful to Y. And I think this will change status already. People that are either it's impressive to see people, even let's say if you just take leaders, you can interview leaders about what's meaningful about being a leader for them, like a Navy SEAL captain, a teacher at a high school, a product manager at a startup or whatever, and people will reveal these things that are meaningful about leadership for them, and you just start being like, wow, I would love to work with you. I would love to work for you. That leadership value that you have is inspiring to me, and it seems like it must create an amazing team. And the more visible this is, the more people will have those kinds of feelings, and it will change the structure of status, I think.
How much of this is something that you can discover analytically? Because I feel like our reaction to these things are so intuitive. Back to the point I was making earlier on, we can just be talked into it by a charismatic person. Maybe a Zoom charisma is different than person charisma, but it's still charisma. We're still kind of it's not like I'm intuiting myself into a value system, and then I'm seeing that, if I lack the cognitive linguistic tools to discover my value system, I'm just going to copy somebody else's value system. Is that better? You're still is your framework only accessible to a small piece of the population, and then they're just going to push it out?
Yeah. So already in my class in the first month, you learn an interview technique. Where you can interview anybody, and I'm pretty confident that you're not projecting values into them when you interview them. You're actually pulling out their sources of meaning. We have a whole bunch of checks in the interview technique to try to make sure that you're not incepting them with a source of meaning that you wish that they have, or making it up, right? There's a whole bunch of double checking in the interview technique. So I think that's real. And then we want to make it actually much more scalable than that, much more accessible than that. So for instance, we have one person we're working with has a machine learning model where you just write a few sentences of a meaningful story. Like, I was with my buddies, we went fishing, something like that. And it's like, oh, is one of these the source of meaning that you mean? And you click, right? And so this is an experiment. It's not, this doesn't have as many checks and balances on it yet as the interview technique. But my hope is that we can build mechanisms like this that will reliably help people do the introspection and will make it accessible to everybody.
How do you motivate them to do it? Like, that's work there. And there's actually quite a lot of cognitive work involved in kind of uncovering these for the subject and for the interviewer, for that matter, or the AI, I guess. So they have to. What are they going to get out of it? How do you talk them into it? And that, I mean, like, how do you convince somebody who doesn't want to do it that they should do it? And is saying, I have too many things to worry about, Joe. Why am I sitting here talking to you about, or going to type all these answers into an AI?
I've never had that problem.
You're selecting for people who already come into your orbit, right? So it's your Twitter groups who are doing it with you now. But how do you get to the people who don't give a damn about, Twitter?
Yeah, so it's a useful thing to know. So so I think there's two things. One is this is rewarding stuff. I guess it was probably like this with your in-laws from the story you told. Like, people actually love to talk about this stuff. They feel seen. Often people cry when you really name their source of meaning, especially if it's kind of alien to you, like, because they feel like they feel seen in a deep way by somebody who actually wouldn't have understood without this like very highly structured conversation. So it's very touching and people love it usually. That's one way, is just the intrinsic value of it. But another way is that it's very useful. So, people do this to cohere with their team about the product they're building in my course a lot, right? Like, so somebody goes through my course, or a couple people on a team go through my course, and they have to agree with everybody else about what's meaningful that they want to make their product around. So this, so then they're all kind of excited to make this kind of map of different things that they find meaningful in their product and where they agree, where they don't. But it's useful in other ways. Like, one of the things that we want to do is build recommender systems, things like YouTube Recommended and Newsfeed, that know what's meaningful to you and get you that. And I think, if you look at, like, if you download Spotify and you start it, or Apple Music, you have this onboarding experience where it says, okay, what genres do you listen to? Do you like Kanye West better, or Run DMC, or whatever? Sometimes these things take 10 minutes. And then it's like, okay, I'm ready to give you great music recommendations. And I think we can do very similar things.
Yeah, I always skip that, by the way. Always. I'm like, boring. I'll just going to, search for this. Because I think of this, when you were talking about Twitter there, it made me think of how I use Twitter. And I think I like Twitter best as well. Although I don't have much of a personal presence on there. Twitter doesn't like me, I find. It's okay, I've gotten over that. You start out, interesting though, you kind of start out from a state, at least I always did, of kind of like, the world around me is indifferent to me, right? And so if that doesn't change, then it's not like I've lost something. It's just like I didn't become a blue check, but like I was never really going to do that. Like, what the heck? Who does that? Those people are different people from me, right? And so there's like, who knows? It's like, but I curate the algorithm, right? So the way that I think of it is, can't click on that. Don't want to click on that political bait, because then I'm just going to get a whole bunch more of it, and I don't want that. Like, I feel the urge to do this, but if I could find a way to sort of like, anonymously click on something and read something without Twitter knowing, because I want to tell Twitter, I want to sort of curate the feed and have it only give me stuff that I'm looking for, right? Sure. And I think of that as kind of like, that's a general way that I try and teach the AI, the neural net or whatever it is, to give me stuff, as opposed to try and communicate in an explicit sense, like, I like alternative rock, like. I don't know. There's some of those songs I like, but I like all other stuff too. I just like good music. Like, there's only two songs from an artist I like. I'm going to tell you, I don't know, my wife and I were listening to stuff from like 90s alt rock stuff, like Nickelback, this Canadian band. Or like, there's the one song, someone will say they repeated the song 4 or 5 times. I don't care. I still like the song. I don't want any more though. don't give me the Nickelback greatest hits. Give me a break. I don't think that like an explicit identification process is going to get that nuance, but I think that an AI could, right? So I don't believe our language actually is going to convey the nuance and anything close to the amount of time I'm willing to invest in going through a UI.
Yeah, I mean, I think we also can infer people's sources of meaning. I think the right thing to do is to check. Like, so Twitter doesn't say anything when it gives you a tweet. It doesn't say why, like what assumptions about you it's making.
Sure.
The ideal thing would be like, those little 3 dots on the right of the tweet. You could click it. You could say, why did you show me this? And it says, I showed you this because I think you're interested in Nickelback and political threads. And you're like, actually, no, bro. Like, I got over my Nickelback phrase. You X that thing out, and it updates the algorithm, right? And so to do that would require a kind of articulacy from you, right? You need to know what it means by political threads. You need to know what it means by Nickelback. But having that articulacy and sharing it with the algorithm lets you like double check and kind of stay on top of your own profile and be kind of conversant in what's happening instead of like a clueless pawn, And so I think that's the right way to do it with sources of meaning also, is that we can guess them, we can infer them, we can try to make a very fluid AI-driven experience. But ideally, also the people can say, oh yeah, that is a source of meaning of mine or not, so that they can make adjustments and also just talk about it with each other too.
And it's got to be. So here's another kind of back to, and I got 2 sort of concepts introduced, and then we'll close. This one is about the adaptive, or the the changing nature of my preferences, and to the concept of insurance. There are some just basic things that I just have to, and like I have to have. And so for insurance, like you can't just because this year you're worried about something, and next year you're going to cancel that insurance policy because you aren't anymore. Like you've kind of like. You just don't buy it now because it's like the chance of, because, for the rest of the world, it doesn't matter whether it's this year or next year, just because your mind happened to be like, it's just sort of the spotlight came onto this sort of section of reality and you're worried about this now and off you go. And now you're worried about something else. Like our kind of capricious nature really, really hampers our ability to stick with stuff, right? Because we're just sort of all over the place, right? And I suppose musically, I am all over the place. Great, that's fine. But for things that kind of matter in my life, I need to be more stable. Like I need to change that tire every time I get a freaking nail in it. And I will for a little while, but maybe in a few years if it happens, I might not. Like I need some kind of, I need to be tied to the mast on certain topics, right? And I'm wondering if values are stable enough ways of accessing that kind of like permanent preference or permanent kind of like a behavioral compulsion. Mm-hmm. Or do they change?
Yeah, they do change. Although they usually change, I think we usually feel intense emotions when they change. So they don't change that often for most people. And they also change when you enter a new context. So I was talking about leadership earlier, right? Maybe you get promoted or something, and then you're suddenly grappling with what kind of leader do I want to be or something, and then you develop a new view on that. Maybe you read some books and you're like, oh yeah, this guy's really inspiring. I'm going to be that kind of leader. So that would be a time where your sources of meaning are changing because you have a new context. But I think, so yeah, I don't know. They're kind of in the middle, and it sort of, it remains to be seen. I think this is a place where my work is a little too early to know what. I think there's probably both. There's probably both kind of capricious, short-term sources of meaning. Maybe my girlfriend's taking clown workshops right now, and she just like loves performing on stage. I'm not sure how long this will last, but I'm still really glad that and I would want a recommender system to know about this and like recommend her clown workshops, but it might not be the case next year.
Yes.
But it's still a good thing it's worth identifying. And then there's other things that will probably be sources of meaning for her entire life.
Well, I mean, my wife, I will say it on there, recently got a tattoo. Ain't much more permanent than that. It's.
Do you like it?
I do, yeah. I mean, I'm very supportive. This gives her a sense of meaning, and I mean that, Joe. This is like we're talking about it last night. My wife and I said, "Oh, I'm interviewing this guy tomorrow about this stuff," and she sort of vaguely cares about this kind of hobby of mine. But she got it, and we had this conversation. It was reference to her kids. We got 4 kids, and so I'm not on the. I'm not. There's no. It's a sort of a pictorial image graphic kind of thing, but it's a reference to our children, and that's your progeny. That is another thing that's equally permanent. There is no, there's like once you've had a kid, that's your kid, and whatever happens to that kid is still a part of you, and so that's equivalently permanent, right? And is a deep sense of meaning for most parents probably, and so there is that's the sort of level of, maybe that's even more permanent than insurance should be. Sort of this family stuff, this sort of like, unbreakable links you have, biological links you have to folks that you share genetic material with. But, I guess there's to me, the intriguing thing about values is just this question, which I, totally get you. We'll see how it turns out. But is this something that might match the sort of level of persistence that you want for something like insurance, or, more generally just sort of virtuous behavior, right? Phrases of your life.
I do think one thing that I'm excited about here is if we do find out that somebody has a fairly long-lasting source of meaning, I think reaffiliation around that is a huge opportunity. I mean, it has been for me. Like, if you change your friend group to be the people that are, the people you want to be like,
yes,
and the people that support your best self, this is great. And I think this is often portrayed as if there's one kind of value, one direction to go in. You should hang out with ambitious friends. You should hang out with people who have their life together, their shit together, or something. This is kind of the conservative talking points. But I don't think of it like that. I think it's like each person needs to make their own profile of the kind of people that bring out their best self. And it might be clowns. I think for my girlfriend, it might be clowns, but they should go and make some clown friends, because that's what's going to support them to blossom, right? And somebody else should maybe go and get some ambitious friends, because that's what's going to support them to blossom. And I think we can be much more intentional about that, much more directed about that as a society. And this will do some of the work that you're talking about, I hope.
Okay. Now, last question. We'll end on this. Tell me where you're at and what the kind of the thing that you're kind of developing right now. You mentioned there next few years a metric that you might be able to scalable. Aggregation of information is a tremendously powerful thing if you can get it. It's one of the reasons why economic growth is so powerful, I think, because you can aggregate it all the way up. It means the same thing in dollars. Is it metrics? What's the sort of current stage of development in the framework? And where can people learn more, as well? Sure.
Yeah. So first of all, the school I run, I'm kind of moving from the school towards trying to make a bigger structure. So the school is at sfsd.io, schoolforsocialdesign.io, and you can go there to learn more. And there's also links to my other kinds of, to this whole ecosystem from that website. So that's probably the best starting website. There's like a textbook that I wrote. There's a lot of material, exercises, stuff like that, all linked from that site. So what I'm trying to do now is build more of a movement, or even a kind of an ideology about this pluralism or this meaning, like reshaping society around meaning. So the school has given us experience for reshaping individual institutions one at a time to make them more meaningful for either users or the people at a workplace, or some group like that. So we've had everything from very small scale meaningful things designed that way, like weddings, individual rituals, to social networks like Facebook, right? So that's always one at a time, and always amongst the designers of the thing, right? So this is kind of easy mode in a way. If you want to change a whole society, you don't do it really one at a time and only with people who have the power to redesign one thing at a time. That will never get you there. And so it's time to think about how you make this into more of a social vision, a broad social vision, like we should make everything more meaningful, right? And also how you build some of these larger structures, like I was saying, this alternative to GDP that captures meaning, economic systems, like we want to make some marketplace, just like the organic is kind of a sub-market of food. We would like to make sub-markets for meaningful things, meaningful workplaces, meaningful apps, things like that. And it's actually pretty wide open right now. Like I feel as I'm talking, I feel like I'm being very vague compared to how I talk when I'm talking about values or redesigning Facebook or something like that. And the reason I'm being vague is because I actually don't really know. But we're building a team, and the team includes machine learning researchers that will figure out how to make some of these recommenders that work for meaning-aligned people and to automatically guess people's sources of meaning, and economic researchers that can help us build these metrics. So there's like a research group. There's probably going to be some startups. There's going to be some more social movement kind of stuff, more political kind of or social vision kind of stuff, and building the team for that and also funding for that is kind of the next stage.
My guest today is Joe Edelman. Joe, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you, David.